Thanks, Mark. I'm Tom Krazit. I'm a writer with CNETnews.com, and I get to ask questions of these two distinguished gentlemen to my left here. We were talking about the subject of this talk last night at the on the lawn, and we agreed that we could probably talk for hours about 12 different things. But I wanted to ask Sidney to relate a recent anecdote that he came across in terms of China's interest in other organizational systems and other political systems, and how that sort of came to be in Salt Lake City.
Oh, it's a good thing I'm used to bright lights in the eye. Yeah, I was telling Tom about an experience that Yulin and I had in Shanghai last October. We were interviewed by a young man from the Academy of Social Sciences, and he told us that he'd just come back from 4 months in Salt Lake City, where he was sent by the Academy to study the Mormon Church. He said, we were interested in finding out how the Mormon Church trains people to be so disciplined, so aggressive at whatever profession they go into, and successful. And he came back with a bag full of interesting assets. So this was an example of the fact that they are studying things that look successful and attractive all over the world, studying them very assiduously. Incidentally, this is not a pitch for Mitt Romney. It just happens to be.
The anecdote brought up one of the questions that you always have about China, or that always seems to come up about China, and how with this modernization, will its political system have to change, and are people actually even looking for a change in the way things are run? And so could you talk a little bit about how the government of China really is looking at alternative ways of structuring its political system in order to encourage people to focus more on consumption or focus more on production, and how those things play out over the next 10, 12 years?
Well, of course they are. The political system is changing. That's a fact. That's a reality. It's changing in ways that are very fundamental, but not always easily observable from the outside. It's sort of changing at the cellular level to a large extent. And one of the issues, as you mentioned, is encouraging consumption. We've heard so much about Chinese espionage in this country, and one of the things that Chinese spies have been successful at finding out is that the secret of the American economy is that Americans spend, they consume, they waste. And so we have, in this country, we have a savings ratio, savings to income. Last year, I think it's something like -1%. In China, it's more like 40 to 45% of income. Younger people are not saving much, but 30 and above are really assiduous savers. And so one of the main programs of the government is to coax the consumers out into the marketplace and to get some of that savings money into circulation. And of course, one of the main ways of doing that, one is they now have more public holidays, I think, than any other country in the world, to get people to just stay home and spend, shop. There are, I don't want to go into detail, but there are huge shopping malls all over the place, in unexpected places. Walmart just purchased 100 Chinese native supermarkets to add to their chain. But the fact is, though, that potential for consumption is still enormous. Another major move in that direction is to reestablish a social safety net. So they've started, again, building out a public health insurance system, pension systems, and so on. These things, At present, only 10% of the population is covered by public health insurance, but they are beginning to expand it. And of course, the big deal here is to get the 800 million people who still live in little villages to come out into the marketplace. So they're stressing rural health services also.
Okay. Scott, from your side of the world, which isn't too far away from China, I mean, where do you see the government's role in encouraging this notion of consumption, and how does that sort of mirror with what you've been studying over the past couple of years?
Well, Japan has changed a lot. Japan used to be just like Sidney describes China today, savings rate 30% or higher. The Americans after them all the time to spend more money on things from the United States, and it never worked. But while no one was paying any attention, the savings rate has dropped below 10%. And the Japanese, of course, are very great consumers. So probably just through the evolution of the economy and the development of a social safety net, what Sidney is saying is going to come to pass. The savings rate in China will drop and consumption will go up. And who benefits from it is an entirely different matter.
How much, I mean, one of the other issues that we always hear about with China and with outside firms trying to come in is intellectual property and all the problems that are thought to exist there. I mean, how much, Sidney, is that a concern of the Chinese people and the government at this time, and how will that change over the next couple of years?
It's a huge concern for the central government because the piracy, the counterfeiting, suppresses the growth of the big Chinese conglomerates, like a software developer. Very hesitant to put something new on the market because it's going to be stolen by one of their own countrymen down south. So there is a big drive by the central government, but it has to deal with resistance from local governments who get part of their income from local counterfeiters. So it's a work in progress. Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, they've all been through this process and more or less got it under control. China's a lot bigger and more complicated. It takes longer.
Okay. Then Scott, I mean, what would you feel has a lot to do with that situation in Japan versus China? I mean, is there resistance on the part of Japanese firms to enter into China because of these concerns, or do those go to a whole different level?
It has an effect on the approach they take to China. The Japanese are much different than the Americans. They don't like to outsource manufacturing unless they have to. But at certain levels, they have to. Low-cost assembly operations have to go overseas. But they've struck a balance between outsourcing what must go overseas and keeping at home either what it's not economically efficient to outsource, or that part of the business that has so much intellectual property that they just don't want to lose it. They've had enough experience with competition from Korea and Taiwan and also China to realize that they have to keep the really important intellectual property and the high-end manufacturing at home in Japan. They don't have a trade deficit with China. They have balanced trade. So even though the labor cost differential by some estimates is as much as 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1, depending on what business you're in, they have it under control. They've managed to balance things out. Probably the risk to IP in China has also affected China's ability to get more foreign direct investment, although I couldn't put a dollar figure on that.
I know we're supposed to be talking about the future this week, but I wanted to bring up some of what's going on this week with the trade talks that have been going on, and I don't know if all of you have seen, but this morning they announced a few minor agreements in terms of the U.S. and China and cooperation going forward. I mean, one of the things that they want to encourage is more flights between the two countries. There's going to be supposedly a doubling of daily flights between the U.S. and China by 2012, so see how that works out. And the other thing that was interesting was that the two countries will agree to cooperate on the development of clean energy technology, or at least put more resources towards that effort. So I mean, this is, also one of the perennial concerns that comes up when people think about China and its emergence as a world power is just the grappling that they have to do with pollution and the need to clean up a lot of these cities. Can you give me a sense, either of you guys, as to how much of a priority that is over the next decade or so, and what that will mean for China's role as both a producing nation and a consuming nation?
Well, cleaning up, controlling pollution, protecting the environment, it has just become really a major issue for the central government in the last 3 years.
Why is that?
Because everyone talked about it, and there were laws saying that any new factory has to have its pollution control system approved before it can be built. But actually it never happened because the predominant mentality was, we're poor, we need to develop, we can't afford to worry about those things. But now they can't afford not to worry about it. They're spending billions every year to treat diseases that result from pollution. So that, in addition to the public opinion factor, have forced them to really put it on the agenda. But again, like everything else in China, it's going to be a process. It's going to be a long process to really get the environment under control. Some people in this country, we had a session with Larry Brilliant at Google. There, Google.org is mounting a major program to help retrofit coal-burning Chinese power plants so that they are clean, environmentally clean. Things like that are being supported by the government and will be significant, I think.
Does that push to clean up the country, though, will that put a brake on its economic development? I mean, obviously you've got to take care of the health concerns and all that, but how do they balance?
Well, that's the thing, Tom, that has changed, because the new generation of leaders, President Hu Jintao, for example, has stated flatly in public that even if it does affect the rate of growth, growth cannot be at the expense of environmental degradation.
And is that a new statement from
That is a new statement, right. Growth has always been number one before this. And now the position they've taken is that growth, yes, but growth not at the expense of welfare, not at the expense of the environment, and not at the expense of spiritual values, whatever that means.
It sounds like there's a common thread here, though. I wonder about how the local governments receive this. I mean, it sounds like, there's these things that come out from the central government. We want you to enforce intellectual property concerns. You need to value the cleanliness of the environment. But do those things actually get implemented or enforced at a local level?
Different degrees. It is a struggle place by place by place. But what they've done, what the central government is doing in the past, the criteria by which you judged whether a local guy got promoted or got approval or not was just growth. Now it's growth plus green growth. The local governments are supposed to report with their local GDP the green GDP ratio in that. It has not worked well so far. It's just been implemented for 2 years now, but they're trying to re-engineer the program so that it will work.
Japan went through a similar type of experience, didn't it, Scott, back when?
Very, very similar, and I think for exactly the same reasons. They felt they were poor, they had to develop as quickly as possible, and the next thing you know, they had mercury poisoning scandals. Thousands of people affected. People are still affected today. And it got so bad that finally they started doing something about it. And now, well, they're not quite compulsive about it, but they're very strict. And in fact, this issue is not only a problem for the Chinese people, it affects exports. You just had the pet food problem here in the United States. But if you go to the store in Japan, say you're going to go buy garlic, You're going to spend $1.50 on garlic. Well, you can get, 2 or 3 cloves of Japanese garlic, or you can get 20 or 30 cloves of Chinese garlic. And if you have the money, nobody buys Chinese garlic or anything else grown in China. People will go to the store and get the package of food and turn it over and find out, where is this made? They don't look just at which company is selling it and where that company is located, because that company is always Japanese. They look beyond to the line that says country of manufacture or country of origin. If it says China, they put it right back on the shelf, because it's poisonous, and they know that. Big problem. And it will be solved with time, because the people selling the goods are Japanese companies, and they're going to enforce the standards required to sell the product in Japan on their Chinese suppliers. That's an example of food. I think in other areas, textiles is one, clothing. Some clothing sellers, vendors in Japan have managed to convince their clients, their customers, that made in China, in their case, equals made in Japan. They're selling it, it's the same quality, don't worry about it. So we have a huge range of like no problem at all to an unbelievable problem. And it all goes back to quality, and environment is a key component of that, especially in food.
But how did Japan manage that transition where they had to suddenly, you still have to grow, you still have to keep producing at the level that you were, but now you have this other factor that we obviously cannot ignore. I mean, how did they manage to keep growth on track while minding the environment as well?
Well, Japan, like China today, was starting at a growth rate close to 10%. There's a lot of leeway there. I mean, if you're at 1%, there's no leeway. But nobody even knows how fast China is growing, but it's very, very fast. So for them to slow down to, say, 7% would just be from fabulous to great. So I think they have leeway to do that. And then, there's the economic push and shove. There's a lot of victims, aside from the healthcare victims, there's other victims as well. So you have a lot of political maneuvering. We'll see who wins.
We've been talking about China in light of the U.S. with the trade talks going on this week, but how are relations between Japan and China at the moment? I mean, it seems like that's going to be a vitally important relationship, going forward. And how are things between the two countries, and how are things evolving?
Sidney?
Well, I think it was last year or the year before at FiRe when they were having big demonstrations in China, anti-Japanese demonstrations. Government was trying to control, and vigorous protests from Tokyo, and all sorts of conflicts. And I remember saying that we believe this is a ramp up to serious negotiations to improve the relationship, and that has actually happened. That's what we see now is a qualitative change in the relationship, where the top leaders are exchanging visits, and Wen Jiabao, the Chinese premier, facing all the anti-Japanese feeling at home, went and made a really quite moderate conciliatory speech to the Japanese Diet. And when he went back to China and talked on TV to the nation, he said, the first thing I did after that speech, I called my 90-year-old mother in Tianjin and asked her how she liked it. And she said it was fine, and then my heart was at rest. And he was okay. So things are changing. Of course, it's very complicated because it seems to me that the present Japanese government is actually moving in two directions at once, apparently contrary directions. They're cuddling up to the Bush administration and cuddling up to China and South Korea at the same time. But I think there is a common logic behind the whole thing. And I think the common logic is that the Japanese leaders feel that being the world's second most powerful economy, that they, in terms of national strength and security and so on, they should also have an independent position in the world. And I think in order to do that, they have to repair their relationships with their Asian neighbors and so on. So I think it makes sense.
So what do you guys think is the greatest obstacle to China's ability to shift more towards a consumption economy, learning the secrets that they've obtained from places like Salt Lake City and Des Moines.
Well, the biggest obstacle is always that when we want to accomplish something very big, biggest obstacle is always to find out what we're doing and what our real aim is, and then find out the roads towards really accomplishing that. Bureaucracy, lack of experience, all of these things. It's mainly, as Craig Venter said last night about their achievements, it's not as much technological as it is philosophical and strategic. And I think those are the issues that they're working towards. How do you run an economy like this in a world like this? How does it operate? And they have to follow the strategy devised by the crafty old Deng Xiaoping. When he started the reforms, he said, we cross the river by groping for stones. We don't draw a diagram of the path we're going to follow. We just take a step and grope, take another step and grope, and so on. I think that's what they're doing.
That remains the strategy today, you think? Okay. So I did want to also ask you a little bit about the investment climate right now in China. Could you characterize what types of companies are looking to do more business there? I mean, certainly in the PC industry, you see all the notebook manufacturing and a lot of IT-related businesses are looking at China. And, but can you give me a sense of what the newest types of businesses are that are looking to expand their operations in China, and where the trends might be for that type of activity over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think that's Sidney's expertise.
You're the banker. You're the banker.
I'm the banker. Yeah, he's pushing it off on me. The Japanese. 2 years ago, when the Chinese decided that they were going to riot against Japanese and take pictures of the riots with Japanese digital cameras, the Japanese decided like Vietnam and Indonesia were really, really good places to build new factories, and they went and they built a lot of new factories in Southeast Asia, and the wage rates are much lower there. But Japanese investment in China continued to rise anyway. And I believe last year was, again, a record high in terms of total value of Japanese investment into China.
And what types of investments are they? Is it mostly still manufacturing related, or are there other types of? Well,
this is why I wanted to defer to Sidney. In the case of the Japanese, it's mostly manufacturing. The difference, probably, the greatest difference between the Japanese and the Americans or the Europeans is that their investment in manufacturing in China is at least partially aimed at selling into China. They've always thought China would be a great consumer market for their products. And it's true. In fact, some of the companies have factories that are dedicated to selling into China, factories that are dedicated to exporting out of China. And we've even got to the point where wealthy Chinese go on shopping trips to Japan. And in the past year, I've noticed a substantial increase in the number of Chinese people walking around. I mean, you can tell because you can hear them. And the Chinese voices on the streets in Tokyo are like way up over last year, and a lot of them come to go shopping. So this is going to change their mentality regarding product quality and how much money they're planning to spend on things. There's going to be quite a lot of evolution, I think, due to the give and take between Japan and China. And also, we cannot underestimate the impact of lots of ordinary Chinese people, ordinary in the sense that they're not government people, but not so ordinary in the sense that they have enough money to travel to Japan. These are going to be more influential people coming to Japan, presumably having a good time, wanting to do it again, and it ought to improve the relations between the two peoples.
Yeah, I think what Scott's saying about Japan applies to the world in general, especially the United States, even more so. We have this strategic economic dialogue in Washington with, I guess, half of the cabinets of both China and the United States taking part. But actually, what Hank Paulson and Vice Premier Wu have to contend with is not their counterpart in the talks. They both have to deal with the U.S. Congress, really. That's what they have to try to avoid a blind outbreak of protectionism and so on, which could do great damage to our economy. But everyone is investing in China today. The interesting thing is financial services are moving in big time. We have venture capitalists like Gary Rochelle has moved to Shanghai. Two of the principals of Ignition Partners have moved to Shanghai with their families, settled there. And the VC in China is very new and not a developed market for venture capital investment yet. But still, the venture capitalists are moving in and settling down for the long term to invest. So the whole scope of investable American money is beginning to invest in China. And of course, Chinese are beginning to invest in this country. And Chinese companies have been called on by the central government to go out to invest outside. They're sitting on, when I last saw, 1.2 trillion US dollars in foreign exchange reserves. And they've got to do something to make money with that money.
Well, we're getting down to the end of it here, and we do have that fabled pre-lunch spot, so I don't want to take too much time, but I did want to, if anyone else has any questions regarding China or the future of that country, I mean, let's hear them.
Marcus Farmhurst from Park. China is making huge investments in education, building schools, universities, hundreds of them are in the plans as far as I know. Can you say something about the impact that will have on this topic as consumers, producers?
The impact that education will have on the China. Well, first of all, you can see the fundamental change in the entire leadership structure in China. It used to be old guerrilla fighters and revolutionary students who came from the cities. Now it's almost entirely engineers. In fact, from the party secretary, premier, to every vice premier, to governors, mayors of big cities and so on, almost 100% engineers. And they have begun the tradition from engineers to lawyers. and
Is that evolution?
Economists and so on. Evolution of people, whatever. So education has fundamentally changed the composition of the entire Chinese leadership structure. And the new expanded education will certainly have a basic impact on China in the future, there's no doubt. It's also an area where they seriously need reform. And educational reform so far has tended to lag behind the general program of economic restructuring.
It's Jim Peoples, Grassroots Marketing. I was wondering about how the legal system has progressed in China and the issue is IP.
Well, the movement in the legal system is very interesting. They now, for the first time, have judges who have studied the law. That's right. It used to be that, old Joe has been a vice commander in the army and he's retiring, so we need to take care of him, we'll make him a judge. And no training in the law whatsoever. But he didn't really need it because the decisions were mainly made by the party committee anyway. So he didn't have to worry too much about it. Well, now that's changing. They have schools for the last 5 years that have been training lawyers to become judges and so on. That's a new thing that's just starting. They've also called for an independent judiciary, but they don't mean by it exactly what we mean by it. They mean that the local government, in China, the court belongs to the government at the same level. So it's not an independent checks and balances setup. So they've called now for local government not to interfere in the decisions of the court, but of course, decisions when they're strategic or political still have to follow the guidance of the party committee. So it's beginning to evolve slowly. I would say if you are a non-political defendant, you probably have about as good a chance in a Chinese court as you do in our court of getting a fair trial. If you're a political defendant, usually the verdict will be written before the trial opens, so forget about it.
We have
Hi
time
there.
for one more.
I have one more question, I hope. David Engel from Project Inkwell. Sidney, this is a question for you about Chinese education and how attention is formed around environmental protection with young people, and what kind of mechanisms are in place to kind of monitor that locally versus kind of cleaning up the mess when it becomes a national problem.
Well, they have, under the Central Environmental Protection Bureau or administration, there are local officers or local officials that are supposed to monitor the implementation of rules. But first of all, the rules are just coming into being. They're very sketchy. And secondly, this whole structure is new and still quite weak. So again, it's a work in progress. They're taking it very seriously and beginning to build a stronger monitoring system. But at present, it's not very strong.
And I think with that, let's have lunch. Thank you.